Hello, today's Bible study comes from the book of Acts, chapter 14, verses 8 through 20, and reads as follows. In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and reeds to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human. Like you, we are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Amen. Well, we start off in Lystra, and there was a man sitting there, and he was lame. He was crippled. He wasn't healed. He needed some healing. Um, and Paul sees him, and Paul walks up to him. Woo! And Paul is getting ready to do some work with him. You can tell because it starts out there was a man sitting there that was lame. And this means we were going to show some compassion and love in some form or fashion. It starts out, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth. He had never walked before. So his legs were never any good from birth. And it doesn't say how old this man was. It just says he was lame from birth. And if he had never walked before, it didn't matter how old he was because he had never experienced it. And he listened to Paul as he was speaking. So he was taking in the word as Paul was speaking the word. And as Paul was preaching this gospel, the man heard Paul speaking. And Paul was speaking about Jesus and things to come. And so Paul looked directly at him. And he saw that the man had faith to be healed. Uh-oh, there's a big thing. The man had faith. He saw that the man had faith to be healed and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to work. The man's faith had healed him. Paul was a vessel, but the man's faith, that's what healed the man. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted out in the Lycaonian language. And I have to look this up, but I'm thinking Lycaonian had to be Greek um, because of who the gods were they called them. You know, Zeus, when they called them Zeus and called them Hermes, these were Greek gods. If you read your mythology books, uh, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I'm assuming that Lycaonian language was a Greek language. The gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, which Zeus was the king of the gods, and Paul was called Hermes, who was Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, and it tells you that they were worshiping a different god. They thought of him as a different god. And they were outside the city. Well, they brought bulls and reeves to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. Wow. Now, they had a I don't know, mythology of Zeus and Hermes, and it tells you about them coming to see us and all these things that they did. Excuse me. But when they called Paul Hermes, because he was Mercury the messenger and he was speaking, but the whole time they were not either one. And then Lycaonians praised them in their language the whole time. And they started preparing to worship them, to pay them homage. And I don't know if Paul and Barnabas understood the language they were speaking or not, but I'm sure they understood what Paul was saying. So that priest went outside, that who was outside the temple, brought the stuff to worship him with. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting. Once they knew what it was and what they were doing, they said, "Friends, why are you doing this?" They let them know this is wrong. There is no need for you to do this. You are not to praise us. You're getting ready to give homage to the ones you shouldn't. And they tell them, we too are only human like you. You know, when you lift these pastors and ministers and everything up on these high pedestals and everything else, our job, their job, your job is to bring the good news, as Paul and Barnabas were, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God. That's what we share. That's what we bring. And Paul and Barnabas were letting them know, you don't worship us. We are not the person. We are telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God. And then they tell you who the living God is, because they tell you he made the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and everything in them. They don't take any credit for this. And then he tells them how kind he was to them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. You wasn't listening. Do your thing. That was in the past. Yet, he has not left himself without testimony. He didn't leave without having witnesses and somebody to testify on who he was and is. See, and then he says, he has shown kindness. How has he shown you kindness? Let me give you some examples. By giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. You may think you have done this, but that rain comes from the Lord. Those crops come from the Lord. The dirt that you plant these crops in, the seed that you have, was given by the Lord. He provides you with plenty of food, not a little bit, not some, but plenty of food. And he fills your hearts with joy. But even with these words, even with those words and acknowledging who God is, they still had difficulty stopping them from doing what they were going to do. The crowd still wanted to sacrifice to them. They couldn't stop them from doing it. They said, we're still going to do it. And Paul was telling them these things that you think these other two gods did. They don't get credit for this, is what was going on when he was telling them too. This ain't Zeus. This ain't Hermes. They're not real. See, this God here, the one that's been doing all this providing, the God of provision, is the true God. These Zeus, the Hermes, they're not gods. They're not real. So there was not even a reason for you to sacrifice or think to sacrifice to us, because we ain't, first of all, them. And then the one you need to sacrifice, we also ain't him. But the truth of the matter is, the one that you think we are, get rid of. Because the one true living God is the one that we represent. The one that healed this man who's been lame and hasn't walked since birth. The one that's provided all these things for you. The one that left us as witnesses to testify to who he is. But don't leave out that evilness of an envious, angry man, because in verse 19 it says, then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. That means they start talking that gibberish. They were going against the Lord, and they won the crowd over. They're probably saying things that were more pleasing to the crowd, that flattered their ear better, and didn't do anything for the spirit. They stoned Paul, and they dragged him outside the city. So them brothers picked up some rocks and started rocking Paul. They thought he was dead. They had rocked him so much. Rocked him to sleep. But after the disciples had gathered around him, the disciples was there. After the disciples had gathered around him, he got up. And, Paul. He went back into the city. He didn't roll out. He didn't run. Hey, God got me. You may have thought I was dead, but I'm coming back to the city. And he went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Amen.